Tell me again, Korath said, his voice low against the wind that pushed through the broken colonnade. Tell me how a soup-line cook silenced the Thornfire conclave. Vale didn't answer immediately. She stood at the balcony's edge, her clawed fingers wrapped around the stone railing, the twin ridges of bone along her jaw catching the late afternoon light. Below them the capital spread in its familiar ruin, and recovery, half the towers rebuilt in pale stone, the other half still blackened stumps from the scorching, their windows' dark mouths open to a sky that had only recently learned to be blue again. You won't like how it starts, Vale said. I never do. She turned from the railing. Even in repose, Vale Sorrenthi carried the coiled weight of a creature bred across 17 generations for war. Her scales were the gray-violet of deep-ocean basalt, fading to pale silver at the throat where old scorched tissue had healed badly. Her wings, folded tight against her back, bore the clan marks of the Sorrenthi lineage, the oldest bonded house in the Kithari Empire. The house that had once commanded 11 warflights and now commanded 2. It starts with a woman named Delacrae, Vale said, and she was nobody. Korath settled into the chair behind him, its carved armrests worn smooth by generations of listeners. He was younger than Vale by 30 cycles, his scales a brighter copper that hadn't yet dulled with age or scarring. A junior consul. The kind who still believed reports, could capture the truth of what had happened at Varath-Ka. Nobody, he repeated. A refugee cook, stationed at the southern intake camp outside Varath-Ka after the last fires died. She ladled broth into bowls for survivors coming down from the highlands. That was the full extent of her authority, a ladle, a pot, and the decision of whether to give you 1 scoop or 2. And the ancient. Vale's pupils contracted. A small thing, involuntary, but Korath noticed it. Even the memory still triggered something in her. We'll get there, she said. But you need to understand what Varath-Ka was before you can understand what happened in it. She crossed the room and lowered herself onto the stone bench along the far wall, her tail curling around her ankles in the unconscious settling gesture of a Kithari warrior at rest. The daylight fell across her in long bars through the colonnade's pillars. Varath-Ka was the last of the deep sanctuaries, she began, cut into the base of Mount Sareth 8,000 years ago when the first Kithari ancestors were still more beast than people. The mountain is volcanic dormant now, but the thermal vents run deep, and the stone holds heat the way a mother holds a sick child. Close. Constant. The sanctuary chambers stay at exactly the temperature a dragon egg needs to quicken. I know about the hatcheries. You know what the records say. I'm telling you what they felt like. Vale's voice flattened and Korath went quiet. The deepest chamber, the Heartstone Chamber, was where the ancients went to die, not because it was tradition, because the heat there was the only thing that could ease the pain of a body that had lived for 6,000 years and was finally, mercifully, shutting down. The basalt walls absorbed their last fire breath and held it. Walk into the Heartstone Chamber a century after an ancient died there, and you could still feel the warmth in the rock. Their final gift, heat for the eggs that would come after them. She paused. Through the colonnade, a formation of young Kithari flew low over the capital on a training patrol, their wingbeats synchronized in the sharp rhythm that Vale herself had drilled into 3 generations of fledglings. When the scorching hit, Varath-Ka burned from the inside. The thermal vents cracked open. Magma channels that had been stable for millennia shifted. The hatcheries, all of them cooked, 1,400 eggs gone in a night. Her claws scraped the stone bench. The intake camp outside was for the survivors who had fled the lower slopes, Kithari and human alike. By the time the fire stopped, the mountain was a tomb. And Delacrae was feeding survivors. Delacrae was feeding anyone who sat down in front of her. She didn't check species registries. She didn't ask for displacement papers. A Kithari warrior with burns across half his body sat down. She put a bowl in front of him. A human child carrying a dead cat sat down. She put a bowl in front of her. Same ladle, same broth, same quiet look that said, "Eat this, you'll feel better, and I'll still be here when you're done." Koreth tapped a claw against his armrest. "That's a generous portrait for someone you'd never met before, Varathka." "I watched her for 3 days before I spoke to her," Vale said. "I was stationed at the camp as the Conclave's eyes. The Thornfire Conclave had sent me to assess the damage and report back on whether Varathka could be reclaimed or whether it needed to be sealed and abandoned. I was supposed to be counting structural fractures and cataloging salvageable egg chambers. Instead, I kept finding myself standing at the edge of the mess tent, watching a human woman with a ladle." "Why?" Vale looked at her hands. The claws were blunt now, filed down a concession to the diplomatic work that had consumed her later years. But the knuckles were still thick with the calcium deposits that came from decades of gripping flight harnesses in combat winds. "Because she was the only person in that camp who wasn't afraid," Vale said. "Everyone else, Kithari, human, the Varathka garrison, the relief workers, even me, we were all carrying the weight of what had been lost. You could see it in how people moved. Careful, quiet, like the ground might open again." Della moved like the ground was solid. She moved like the soup mattered. Like getting the temperature right on a bowl of broth was the most important thing in the world, and maybe, on that particular morning, it was. There must have been others who kept working. There were, but working and being unafraid are different things. The garrison commander worked around the clock and his hands shook the whole time. The medics treated burns and fractures and kept their voices professionally steady while their eyes told a different story. Della's hands were still, not rigid still the way water is still when nothing is disturbing it. She'd lost her settlement, her family, her home. I learned that later. Everything she owned fit in a bag under her cot. And she stood at that soup line every morning like it was the most natural place in the world to be. She stood and walked back to the balcony. The sun was lower now, the shadows of the rebuilt towers stretching long across the courtyards below. On the second day, I saw something that stayed with me. A Kithari fledgling barely a year past hatching, burns on both wings, too young to fly, came to the soup line alone. No parent, no guardian. Just this small dragon, no bigger than a human child with peeling scales and bandaged wingtips, dragging himself to the tent because he was hungry and didn't know what else to do. He couldn't hold the bowl. His claws were blistered. Della saw him, went around the counter, sat cross-legged on the ground in front of him and held the bowl while he drank. She didn't speak. She didn't make a fuss. When he was done, she wiped his chin with her apron and the fledgling pressed his head against her knee, and she let him stay there until he fell asleep. Then she lifted him carefully, like something made of glass and fire, and carried him to the medical tent herself. Nobody helped. Nobody moved. Not because they didn't care. Because they were watching the way you watch something you don't have a word for yet. A human woman carrying a Kithari fledgling across a refugee camp, singing to him under her breath, her apron still damp from the broth, and the fledgling's burned wings hanging limp and trusting over her arms. I saw a veteran warrior standing near the medical tent with his fist pressed against his jaw, a Kithari grief gesture. He wasn't grieving for the fledgling. He was grieving for himself, for his people, because he knew what he was seeing was something the entire empire had failed to provide, and a single human had offered without being asked. She paused. The memory seemed to require its own silence. On the third morning, the camp almost fell apart. One of the aftershocks cracked the water main that ran from the Highland Reservoir. Suddenly, we had no clean water for 5,000 refugees. The garrison commander sent a repair team, but the pipe was buried under 3 meters of volcanic rubble. The estimate came back, 48 hours minimum. 48 hours without water. For a camp already stretched past its limits, the medics started rationing. Fights broke out at the secondary pump station between Kithari warriors who wanted priority and human families queuing since dawn. A group of Kithari from the lower garrison started talking about leaving for the northern settlements. If they left, the perimeter collapsed. If the perimeter collapsed, the volcanic predators circling the ash fields, heat-adapted carrion hunters drawn by thermal blooms, would have access to the civilian tents. What did Della do? She walked to the rubble pile, looked at it, and asked the repair team leader one question. "Where exactly is the break?" he told her. She went back to the mess tent, took apart one of her camp stoves, a pressurized unit with a narrow-bore fuel line and a junction fitting, and brought the parts to the repair team. She said, "The pipe is cracked, not severed. You need to sleeve the crack from the inside." She showed them how the fuel line could be threaded into the water pipe from the downstream access point, fed through to the crack, and expanded with pressure to create an internal seal. A field repair. The kind of thing you learn when you've spent 15 years keeping camp stoves running with no spare parts. It worked. Water was flowing again by noon. The garrison commander looked at Della like he was seeing her for the first time. She shrugged and went back to her soup pot. But after that, people started coming to Della for things that had nothing to do with soup. A Kithari egg tender whose portable incubation lamp had broken. A human father whose daughter's fever wasn't responding to the standard medkit. A pair of refugee children who had lost their blankets. They came because she listened, and because her solutions were practical, immediate, and offered without ceremony. She was becoming the camp's center of gravity. Not by authority, not by rank, by the simple fact that she was the person who didn't stop when the problem was hard, and she didn't distinguish between the problems that were hers and the ones that weren't. She fixed the incubation lamp with wire from a cargo pallet and a heating coil from a broken field oven. She identified the girl's fever as a reaction to volcanic particulates and rigged a breathing filter from surgical gauze and broken goggles. She gave the children her own blankets and slept in her jacket. Vale's tail scraped the stone floor. That afternoon, the egg tender came back with 2 other tenders. The portable egg vault, the fireproof container holding the last 26 surviving eggs from the deep hatcheries, was losing temperature. Its power cell was cracked. Without stable warmth, the eggs would go dormant within 72 hours. Della fixed it. Della built a passive thermal rig out of materials from the camp's waste pile, volcanic rock still radiating residual heat, wrapped in insulating layers stripped from damaged cargo containers, arranged to maintain egg viability temperature within half a degree, with scrap that every other person had been stepping over for 4 days. A senior egg tender named Catherine, who hadn't spoken to a human in 3 years, looked at Della and said, "Who taught you thermal dynamics?" And Della said, "Nobody. I just cook a lot." That evening I found her sitting behind the mess tent, alone. She was holding a photograph, a small print, creased and water-stained, of a family standing in front of a highland farmhouse. A man, a woman, and 2 children. The farmhouse was made of the pale stone they quarry near the summit settlements. I recognized the area because I'd flown over it during the scorching. Nothing was left. The entire settlement was a char mark on the mountain's flank. Her family. She didn't know I was there. I watched her hold that photograph, and what I saw wasn't grief. It was something older and quieter than grief. The expression of a person who has already done all their crying and has arrived at the place on the other side where the loss lives as a fact rather than a wound. She looked at the photograph, and she folded it carefully, and she put it in her breast pocket, and she went back inside and started prepping the next morning's broth. And the broth was the same temperature it always was, and her hands were still. On the 4th day, something came down from the mountain. Kareth leaned forward. "Not something, someone." Vale's voice dropped, and the quality of it changed from a storyteller's practiced rhythm to something raw and present, as if the memory had teeth. The scouts saw it first, a shape moving through the ash fields on the northern slope, picking its way between the collapsed ventilation towers. At first they thought it was a rockslide. The scale of it was wrong for anything alive. The shape was the size of a cargo shuttle, and it moved with the grinding deliberation of something ancient pulling itself forward one length at a time. Then it shifted direction, and they saw the wings. An ancient Corvushan. The name came out of Vale like an exhalation held too long. The last ember of Sarath, 6,400 years old, the oldest living Kithari in the Empire. The Heartstone Chamber had been built for her, not around her, for her, because she was the one who had first breathed fire into the basalt walls when the sanctuary was young. Every egg that had ever quickened in Varath-Ka had done so in the warmth of Corvushan's ancient gift. She survived the scorching. Barely. Her body had been failing for centuries, the slow winding down that all ancients go through, the organs shutting down in sequence, the fire glands calcifying, the joints stiffening until each step is a negotiation with gravity. The scorching should have killed her. The magma channels broke through the Heartstone Chamber floor and filled the space with sulfurous gas and heat beyond even a dragon's tolerance. Instead, she dragged herself out through a ventilation shaft that had partially collapsed, tearing her wing membranes on the broken stone, and spent 3 days in the ash fields above the mountain, blind from the sulfur, her scales cracked and weeping fluid, crawling toward a sound she could hear from the camp below. What sound? Vale looked at him. Singing. The words sat between them. Delacrae sang while she worked, Vale said. Not performance, not entertainment. The way a person hums a tune while washing dishes, something old, something muscle memory, something that lives in the hands and the breath rather than in the mind. She sang old colony songs, work songs from the highland settlements where she'd grown up before the scorching, songs about planting and weather and the color of the sky at 6 in the morning. She sang them quietly, under the clatter of pots and bowls, and most people in the camp didn't even notice. But Corvushan did. Corvushan's hearing was the last sense still fully functional. Her eyes had clouded centuries ago. Her fire glands had calcified. Her sense of smell was gone, burned out by the sulfur. But her hearing, the deep resonance sensors along a Kithari's jaw, the ones that can pick up subaudible vibrations through solid stone, those still worked. And she heard a voice. Not a dragon's voice, not a war cry or a ritual chant or a dirge for the dead eggs. A human voice, singing about whether it would rain tomorrow. Vale's tail swept across the stone floor in a slow arc. You have to understand the scale of what she did. An ancient's body is not built for crawling. Corvushan's limbs were designed for the slow, magisterial pace of a sanctuary guardian, a pace that communicates permanence. To crawl, she had to flatten her body against the ash and drag herself forward with her forelimbs, her chest scraping jagged cooled lava ridges with each pull. The ash fields are a landscape of collapsed ventilation pipes and crevasses where the ground split during the scorching. She crossed that terrain blind, in temperatures that would have killed any dragon under 1,000 years old. She crossed it because she heard a voice that wasn't screaming, that wasn't cursing, that wasn't begging. A voice that was singing about the weather. 3 days. 3 days, and each day the voice was a little clearer, a little closer. She told me later through the resonance communication that developed between her and Della, a shared vibration language that was neither words nor music, but something between. She told me that the song she followed most strongly was the one about the sky's color at dawn. The frequency of that particular melody matched a harmonic in her own chest that she hadn't felt resonate since the sanctuary was first built. As if the human voice was keying into a vibration that had been waiting 6,000 years for someone to complete it. She told you this. Not in words, in vibration. When an ancient communicates through resonance, you don't hear it, you feel it. Images, impressions, emotional textures that translate into understanding the way a smell translates into memory. I sat in the Heartstone Chamber 3 months after the reconstruction, and Corvushan pressed her jaw against the stone floor and hummed, and I felt 3 days of crawling through ash fields with nothing but a distant voice for a compass. I felt what hope feels like when you're 6,000 years old and your body is failing, and the world you built is burning, and the only thing keeping you moving is the knowledge that somewhere below you, someone is singing like it's going to be all right. Vale's voice had gone raw. She steadied it. I was the first to see her reach the camp perimeter. I was doing my morning inspection of the eastern barrier, checking for structural compromise from the aftershocks. And there she was. A dragon the size of a cargo freighter, her scales gray-black with ash, her wings dragging behind her like torn sails, her breath coming in slow, rattling pulls that I could feel through the ground under my feet. She had stopped at the edge of the mess tent's firelight, and she was listening. What did the camp do? Panicked, obviously. A Kithari ancient the size of a small building appearing out of the ash fields at dawn. Half the garrison grabbed weapons. The relief coordinator started evacuating the civilian tents. Someone triggered the emergency beacon, which meant the conclave would know within the hour. I heard a medic shouting about containment protocols. 2 Kithari warriors launched into the air and circled overhead, talons extended. The whole camp fractured in about 90 seconds. And Delacroix. Vale almost smiled. Almost. The expression shifted the scarred scales at her jaw in a way that suggested she'd learned the gesture from humans rather than born it. Delacroix looked up from her soup pot, saw a 6,000-year-old dragon bleeding in the ash outside her tent, and said, and I am quoting exactly, "Well, you look like you could use something warm." She let that land. Then she picked up a bowl, filled it with broth, walked across the firebreak line that every other person in the camp was running away from, and set it down in front of Corvushan's cracked and weeping muzzle. Didn't flinch. Didn't hesitate. Didn't look around for permission or confirmation. She put the bowl down, stepped back 2 paces, and waited the way you wait for a stray animal to decide you're safe. The garrison commander didn't stop her. He tried. He shouted an order from behind the barrier sandbags. Della didn't look at him. She was watching the dragon. And the garrison commander, a veteran of 3 fire seasons, a decorated officer, took one look at Corvushan's eyes and stopped moving. Because even through the milky clouds of 6 centuries of blindness, the ancient's gaze was fixed on Della with an intensity that made the rest of the world irrelevant. The ancient drank. Not immediately. Corvushan's jaw muscles had atrophied. She couldn't open her mouth wide enough to drink from the bowl. Della saw the problem. She went back to the mess tent, got a ladle, came back, and started spooning the broth directly into the gap between Corvushan's front teeth, tilting the ladle at an angle that let the liquid run along the ancient's tongue without requiring her to move her jaw. A practiced motion. The same careful angle she used when feeding the elderly refugees whose hands shook too much to lift their own bowls. Vale's voice had gone very quiet. She fed a 6,000-year-old dying dragon with a soup ladle, spoonful by spoonful, kneeling in the ash in front of a creature whose single breath in her prime could have leveled a city block. And while she fed her, she sang the planting songs, the weather songs, the one about the color of the sky. She sang them the same way she always did, quietly, under her breath, as if feeding an ancient was just another morning task between washing the pots and setting out the bread. Korath realized his hands were gripping the armrests of his chair. He relaxed them deliberately. I should have stopped her, Vale said. Protocol was clear. An injured ancient required a bonded handler from the conclave, medical assessment by a senior healer, and isolation from unregistered contacts. Delacroix was none of those things. She was a refugee cook with a ladle. I should have pulled her back and called for the proper authorities. But you didn't. I didn't because I watched Corvushan's eyes. Vale turned from the balcony and faced Korath directly. Ancients' eyes cloud as they age, a milky film that builds over centuries until they're functionally blind. Corvushan's eyes had been fully clouded for 300 years. Every healer in the Empire had documented it. The last ember of Sarath was blind. She paused, and the pause had the weight of a held breath. When Delacroix sang to her, when that quiet, unremarkable human voice drifted into the resonance chambers of the oldest dragon alive, the clouds in Corvuscan's eyes thinned. Not fully, not a miracle cure, but the milky film receded enough that for the first time in 3 centuries, Corvuscan could see. And the first thing she saw was a woman kneeling in front of her with a ladle, singing about rain. The silence in the room was the kind that has weight. The fledgling, the burned one Della had carried to the medical tent the day before, pushed through the tent flap and came running across the compound on his blistered legs. He had heard something. Every Kithari in the camp had heard something. He came running and pressed himself against Della's side, and he looked up at Corvuscan's massive face, and his burned wings lifted in recognition of something primal. What had they heard? Corvuscan made a sound, Vale said. Not a roar, not even a proper vocalization. A vibration in the deep resonance chambers of her chest, subaudible to humans, but I felt it through my feet, through my bones, through the clan marks on my wings. Every Kithari in the camp felt it. A warrior beside the barrier dropped to one knee without understanding why. The garrison commander's second in command, a grizzled veteran who hadn't shown emotion in 30 years, put her face in her hands. It was a sound that hasn't been made in the Kithari language for 2,000 years. The old texts call it the Vethkal, the choosing. The bonding sound. Ancients don't bond. That's what we believed. Ancients are beyond bonding, they're so old, so far removed from the individual connections that younger Kithari form, that they exist in a kind of permanent solitude. The last recorded Vethkal from an ancient was 4,000 years ago, and the scholars who documented it noted it as an anomaly, probably a death rattle misidentified. But I heard it. Every dragon in that camp heard it, and we knew what it was. She sat down again, heavily, as if the telling was costing her something physical. The emergency beacon reached the conclave within the hour as expected. What I didn't expect was the response. The Thornfire conclave didn't send a medical team. They sent the full conclave, all 9 elders, the sovereign herself, 14 warflights as escort, over 300 dragons in formation, the sky darkened with wings. They came because the beacon's telemetry included my biometric readings, and my biometric readings showed that I, a bonded warrior of the Sorrenthi line, a veteran of 11 fire seasons, was experiencing resonance shock. The involuntary physiological response that occurs when a Kithari witnesses a Vethkal. They came because they didn't believe it. They came because they were terrified of it. The Vethkal is not just a bonding sound, it's a declaration. When an ancient, the living repository of the Empire's oldest fire, the creature whose breath built the sanctuary walls, whose warmth quickened every egg for 8 millennia, when that ancient chooses a bond companion, it is the single most significant act in Kithari law. It supersedes the conclave. It supersedes the sovereign. It supersedes treaties, territorial claims, and the entire hierarchy of power that the empire is built on. Because the bond companion of an ancient is, by 8,000 years of unbroken precedent, the voice of the Heartstone, the one who speaks for the mountain, the one whose word in matters of the sanctuary is final. And Corvuscan had chosen a soup line cook. Corvuscan had chosen Delacroix, a human woman with no rank, no title, no Kithari bloodline, no bond training, no understanding of what had just happened to her. A woman who, when the 14 warflights arrived and the sky went dark with dragons, looked up from where she was still kneeling beside the ancient, still holding the ladle, and said to me, because I was the closest Kithari, should I make more soup? That's a lot of people. Koreth made a sound that might have been a laugh strangled into a cough. Vale's expression didn't change. The sovereign landed first. Threskal, the undimmed ruler of the Kithari Empire for 600 years, a dragon whose fire could melt starship hull plating, whose voice had ended wars and started them. She landed in the ash field outside the mess tent, and the ground shook with the impact of her weight. She folded her wings that spanned 40 meters and looked at Della Cray kneeling beside Corvishon. She looked for a long time. The camp was silent. 300 dragons circling overhead. 5,000 refugees pressed against tent walls. And the sovereign of the Kithari Empire dipped her head toward a human woman holding a soup ladle. She bowed. She acknowledged. There's a difference, but it's smaller than the conclave would like to admit. And the elders. Not all of them followed. That's the part the official record smooths over. Vale's expression hardened. Elder Vashton stepped forward, but not to kneel. He was the oldest member of the conclave, the one whose word carried the most weight in matters of precedent. He had opposed human integration into Kithari society for centuries. He had voted against every joint settlement, every shared garrison, every cultural exchange. He was the wall that human Kithari relations had broken against for as long as I'd been alive. He challenged the Vethkal. He challenged the interpretation. He said the sound was a death rattle. He said Corvishon's mind had degraded past the point of meaningful choice. He said 8,000 years of precedent couldn't be overturned by a vibration from a creature that might not survive the night. He cited 11 legal precedents, 3 doctrinal rulings, and the conclave's own charter on cognitive requirements for valid bonding declarations. He said these things loudly, in the formal cadence of conclave deliberation, standing in the ash of a dead mountain, while a human woman knelt beside the oldest dragon in the world. How did Della react? She didn't. She wasn't listening to Vashton. She was watching Corvishon, and Corvishon's breath had turned shallow. The broth had helped, but the ancient's body was failing. Her cracked scales were leaking clear fluid. The torn wing membranes had started to stiffen in the open air. Della turned to the closest medic, a Kithari healer who had frozen at the edge of the confrontation, and said, "She needs something for the pain, something warm and damp on those wing tears. Now, please. Whatever else you're all arguing about can wait." She gave an order to a Kithari healer. She asked, but the way she asked didn't leave room for discussion. The healer looked at Vashton, who was still speaking. The healer looked at Della, who was already pulling off her own apron, dampening it with water from her canteen, and pressing it gently against the worst of the wing tears. Corvishon's resonance chambers hummed a low, sustained note that every Kithari recognized as relief. The ancient's massive body settled into the ground. Her breath steadied. And the healer moved, started treating the ancient. Vashton stopped mid-sentence because you cannot argue the invalidity of a bond while the bond companion is actively caring for the bonded, and the bonded is responding. That's not a legal principle. That's just reality being louder than rhetoric. Vale's claws clicked against the balcony railing. Elder Koresh, the youngest elder, the one most open to human cooperation, knelt next. Then Elder Satha. Then 3 more. Vashton remained standing. Elder Thon, the military commander, remained standing. Elder Vrecht, the genealogical keeper, remained standing. 3 out of 9, their feet planted in the ash. A split conclave. The first in 400 years. And then Corvishon settled it. She moved. This creature who hadn't walked under her own power in decades, she shifted her massive head slowly, until her muzzle rested in Della Cray's lap. The weight of that skull, larger than Della's entire torso, settled onto the legs of a woman who weighed less than one of Corvishon's teeth, and Della held it. She put both hands on the ancient's snout, one on each side, and she held that head in her lap the way you hold something precious that has been given to you without your asking. Vashton knelt. Not immediately. First he looked at Corvishon's eyes. The clearing was still progressing. The amber irises were visible now, deep and ancient and focused entirely on the human woman. Vashton was searching for confusion, for the vacancy of a degraded mind. What he found was the clearest, most deliberate gaze he had ever seen from a dragon of any age. Corvishon knew exactly what she was doing. He knelt. He knelt in the ash and said, "Voice of the Heartstone, the mountain awaits your word." Then Thon knelt. Then Vrecht. All 9. Then the sovereign confirmed it with a single word in the old language, accepted. 14 warflights held formation above a refugee camp while the most powerful dragons in the empire knelt before a woman holding an ancient's head in her lap. She breathed, the air between them felt thin. What did Della say? Vale closed her eyes. When she opened them, the vertical pupils were wide, and there was something in them that Korath had never seen in a Kithari warrior's gaze, something he recognized as wonder. She said, "I don't understand what's happening, but she's hurt and she's old and she came a long way to get here, and I think she needs to go home. Can we take her home?" Vale crossed her arms over her chest, her wings shifting beneath their bindings. The sovereign looked at Della, looked at Corvishon, whose clearing eyes were tracking Della's voice with a focus that no blind ancient should have been capable of, looked at the 9 elders kneeling in the ash, and Threskal said, "The mountain is broken. The Heartstone chamber is gone." And Della said, "Then we build her a new one." Korath set down his stylus entirely. "That was the moment," Vale said. "Not the Vethkal, not the kneeling, that sentence. We build her a new one, because Della didn't say you build her a new one. She didn't say they or someone. She said we. She included herself in the work without thinking about it, the same way she included everyone who sat down in front of her soup pot without checking, without asking, without making a distinction between the ones who belonged and the ones who didn't." She was pacing now, her tail sweeping in long arcs behind her. The reconstruction of Verath Ka began that afternoon, not in 3 months after a conclave review and a structural assessment and a funding allocation. That afternoon, because the voice of the Heartstone had spoken, and what the voice said was we build her a new one, and the conclave for the first time in 8,000 years didn't argue. Threskal assigned 14 warflights to the clearing operation. Every Kithari in the camp who could lift stone was put to work. And Della Cray, who had no engineering training, walked into the ruins with a headlamp and a notebook and said, "Show me what it used to look like." That didn't sit well with the engineers. Master Builder Torek refused to speak to her for the first 3 days. He was the finest living Kithari architect, responsible for the restoration of 2 other sanctuaries. He had drawn preliminary plans before Della's boots touched the first stair. And here was this human with a notebook telling him to show her. He nearly petitioned Vashton to rescind the recognition. What changed his mind? Della spent those 3 days sitting in different parts of the ruins, alone, touching the walls. She'd press her palms flat against the basalt and close her eyes and stay there for minutes. Torek thought it was superstitious nonsense. He said so to me loudly. On the 4th day he walked past the secondary hatchery and found Della with her notebook full of temperature readings. She'd marked every spot where the basalt still held residual warmth from the old thermal channels. She'd mapped the ghost of the heat system by feel, with her bare hands against the stone, and her map matched Torek's archival plans within 2%. 2%. By a woman who'd never seen the plans. She said the stone was warm in some places and cold in others, and it seemed important. Torek took her notebook, looked at it, looked at her, and said, "What else did you notice?" They worked together after that. He taught her to read the basalt's grain structure. She taught him how to test thermal consistency with a canteen of water and a timer. They argued about chamber angles and ceiling heights, and the arguments were the productive kind, the kind between people who respect each other's competence. Vale stopped pacing. But the harder resistance wasn't professional. It was political. A faction of the conclave support structure, the administrative class, the archivists, the genealogical clerks couldn't accept a human voice. They filed challenges. They questioned the Vethkal's validity in closed sessions. They sent representatives to Verath Ka to observe Della and report back on any misstep that might justify her removal. For weeks there were watchers in the shadows of the reconstruction site, taking notes, waiting for her to fail. Did she know? She knew. I told her during the second week. I felt she deserved the warning. She listened, nodded, and said, "Are they hungry? Because I've got soup going and the portions are big enough for watchers too." Next morning there was a row of bowls set out near the observation post. The watchers ate in shifts. By the third week 2 of them were helping carry stone. That's Della. She didn't fight the opposition. She fed it, and somehow that worked better than any formal defense could have. She turned back to the balcony. In the 7th week, a delegation arrived from the Koresh Holdings minor nobility, old blood, 3 generations of fire priests who traced their lineage to the second sanctuary founding. Lord Thresar, the delegation's leader, was livid. He brought a formal petition signed by 63 minor houses, arguing that a human-handling egg chamber construction was a contamination of the bloodline heritage. He threatened to withdraw recognition of any eggs quickened in the rebuilt chambers, which would have fractured the empire's egg registry and turned every future hatchling into a legal dispute. How was it resolved? Della walked in. She'd heard everything from the corridor. She stood in front of Lord Thresar, a human woman in a stained apron, stone dust in her hair, a pencil behind her ear, and she said, "I understand your concern. This place is sacred to your people and you're afraid I'm going to damage it. I can't prove I won't, but I can show you what I've done and you can decide for yourself whether it serves the eggs or hurts them. Will you walk through the chambers with me?" He agreed. He was so surprised by the directness that he agreed before he could formulate a refusal. Della walked him through every chamber she'd worked on. She showed him the thermal mapping. She showed him where the firekeeper's traditional channels intersected with her adapted dampers. She showed him Corvushan's favorite resting spot, where the ancient had pressed her flank against the new wall and the basalt had absorbed her residual heat. Thresar stood in the secondary hatchery for 10 minutes after the tour, not speaking. He touched the wall. He held his hand there, and he felt the warmth, the same warmth Della had mapped with her bare palms weeks before. He withdrew the petition and sent his own fire priests to assist with the upper chambers. And the thermal system, the turning point. The firekeepers had been trying to balance the thermal channels using traditional resonance techniques, singing specific frequencies into the stone to open or close mineral micropores in the basalt. It worked, but it required constant attention. 3 keepers per channel, rotating shifts, around the clock. Della watched them struggle for 3 days, then asked, what if the stone could regulate itself? She adapted a principle from her camp stove's mechanical dampers. Basalt valves, cut to specific thicknesses, placed at intervals along the thermal channels. When the temperature rose too high, the stone expanded and narrowed the channel. When it cooled, the stone contracted and let more heat through, self-regulating. Torek called it the most significant innovation in sanctuary engineering in 300 years. Della called it a damper. And Corvushan during all of this. Corvushan stayed at Della's side. The ancient followed her through the ruins like a mountain following a compass needle, and she sang. Not human songs, dragon songs. Deep resonance harmonics from the old language, vibrations that made the fresh-cut basalt ring. The stonemasons learned to time their work to the ancient singing, because the vibration helped the mortar set and the stone seat properly. The bond was strengthening. Every day. Corvushan's vision continued to clear. By the 8th week. She could track movement across the full width of the construction site. Her scales, which had been cracked and weeping when she arrived, began to regenerate. Not fully, she was still dying, still winding down, but the degradation slowed. The healers couldn't explain it. They ran tests, consulted archives from 4 previous ancients' final decades. Nothing accounted for a reversal of age-related decay in a dragon past 6,000 years. Nothing except the bond. Nothing except Della. When Della was present within resonance range, about 300 meters, Corvushan's vital signs stabilized. Her breathing deepened. The tremors in her forelimbs diminished. When Della was away at the supply depot or the comm station, Corvushan's vitals deteriorated within the hour. The healers documented it. Chart after chart showing the same pattern. Della present, stable. Della absent, decline. Not magic. Resonance. The bond vibration was literally keeping Corvushan's body from shutting down. Della knew. I told her during the 9th week. I showed her the charts. She looked at them for a long time. Then she said, "Well, I guess I'm not going anywhere." She said it the same way she'd said everything else, matter of fact, without drama. As if the discovery that her presence was sustaining the oldest living dragon in the Empire was just another logistical consideration, like making sure the soup pot was the right size. I asked her once about the bond itself. I found her sitting on a pile of cleared rubble, eating a ration bar, while Corvushan lay curled behind her like a scaled cliff face, her massive head resting near Della's feet. The fledgling from the camp was curled in Della's lap, bandaged wings draped over her knee. I sat down beside them. I said, "Do you understand what's happened? What the Vethkal means?" What did she say? She said, "I understand that she's in pain and she's old and she's lost everything that mattered to her. And I understand what that feels like because I lost my family in the scorching and my settlement and everything I owned. And I understand that when you've lost everything, the thing you need most is someone who'll sit with you and not ask you to be anything except what you are right now." Then she finished her ration bar and went back to work. Vale's voice had steadied, but her hands hadn't. One morning in the 10th week, I came down to the secondary hatchery and found them together. Della's human voice carrying the melody while Corvushan's chest resonance carried the bass, and the sound moved through the mountain like a second heartbeat. The fledgling asleep in Della's lap, Corvushan's amber eyes half closed, her breath slow and steady. A human, a fledgling, and a dying god making music together in the guts of a ruined mountain. I stood in the corridor and listened, and for the first time since the scorching, I believed Varath-Ka might live again. She was quiet for a moment. On the day the Heartstone Chamber was completed, the conclave assembled again. All 9 elders, the sovereign, every war flight in the Empire. They filled the sky above Varath-Ka until the mountain's shadow was made of wings. Della stood at the entrance to the new chamber, the chamber she had helped rebuild, the chamber whose thermal channels she had mapped with her bare hands, the chamber whose self-regulating basalt valves were her design. And Corvushan. Corvushan walked into the chamber, slowly, each step deliberate, her massive clawed feet finding the paths that Della had cleared and smoothed. The chamber was warm, not the artificial warmth of a heating system, but the deep geological warmth of a living mountain, channeled and shaped by Kithari firekeepers working alongside human engineers. Corvushan lay down, and she breathed. One long, slow breath, the last reserves of fire in her ancient glands flowing out of her, and into the basalt walls the way water flows into dry earth. The stone glowed, not with the destructive heat of the scorching, with the gentle, sustaining warmth that had quickened eggs for 8,000 years. Corvushan's final gift, the same gift she had given when the sanctuary was young, now given again into walls that a human woman had helped rebuild. Vale's voice was very controlled now, the control of someone holding something carefully so it wouldn't break. Della watched from the chamber entrance. She didn't enter. She understood without anyone telling her, without any protocol or ritual instruction, that this was Corvushan's moment, the ancient's final act, the closing of a circle 8,000 years wide. And Della stood at the threshold with her hands folded and her ladle hanging from her belt, and she watched, and she did not look away, and she did not cry, though I think she wanted to. Did Corvushan die? Not then, not yet. Vale's jaw tightened. After the breath, after the fire gift, Corvushan lay in the warmth of the chamber she'd helped build twice, once when the world was young and once when it had nearly ended, and she turned her massive head toward the entrance, toward Della, and her eyes, those eyes that had been clouded for 300 years until a woman's singing cleared them, her eyes were bright, clear, the color of heated amber, deep and ancient and absolutely present. She saw Della, She saw Della, and Corvishan spoke. Not in the Kithari common tongue, not in the formal high language of the conclave, in the old language, the first language, the one that existed before the Kithari had words, when they had only sounds and the meanings those sounds carried in the chest. A single phrase that every dragon above Varathka heard and understood the way you understand a heartbeat, not through translation, but through the body itself. What did it mean? Roughly, and I say roughly because the old language doesn't translate neatly into words, it meant, I have lived long enough to hear kindness without conditions. That is enough. That is the whole of it. And the dragons above went silent. Every warflight, every escort, every fledgling who had flown up from the lower camps to watch. The sky full of dragons, and not one of them moved. Not one wing beat. They hung in the thermal updrafts of the mountain in perfect stillness, and the only sound was the echo of the old language rolling through the stone and the distant, quiet voice of a human woman who had started singing again, not because the moment called for it, not because anyone asked, but because that's what Della did when someone she cared about was lying still and needed to hear something that wasn't silence. What happened after the reconsecration? The eggs were brought in. The 26 survivors from the vault, the ones Della had kept alive with her scrap-rock thermal rig, each placed in a depression along the thermal channels her basalt valves regulated. The firekeepers sang the quickening chant, the old harmonic sequence used for 8,000 years to invite dormant eggs to wake. Did it work? Not at first. Dormancy creates a thermal barrier within the shell. The firekeepers sang for 2 hours. Nothing. The readings were perfect. Della's valves holding the gradient exactly, but the eggs weren't responding. What changed? Della was standing at the entrance, watching. She'd been told firmly that the quickening was a sacred Kithari rite and human presence at the threshold was already pushing the boundaries. She was not to interfere. She stood with her hands folded and she didn't interfere. But she was singing. Under her breath, the quiet continuous humming that lived in her like a pulse. And Corvishan heard it. Corvishan heard it. The ancient, lying in the center of the chamber, her amber eyes watching Della, she responded. A shift in her own chest resonance, picking up Della's melody and weaving it into the firekeeper's chant. The human song and the Kithari chant merged in the ancient's resonance chambers and emerged as something new. A frequency combining deep geological dragonfire vibration with the lighter, warmer overtones of a human voice. The eggs responded. The smallest first, the mottled one with the thin, damaged shell that the tenders had almost left behind. It flushed pink. The thermal sensor spiked. And the head egg tender, the one who had told Della to stay at the threshold, turned and looked at her with an expression I will carry with me until I die. Then the others, one by one. 26 eggs responding to a frequency that shouldn't exist. The firekeepers stopped their chant. The frequency was self-sustaining now, humming through the basalt, through the valves Della had designed. The mountain itself was singing. Vale sat down for the last time. The sun was nearly gone, the colonnade's shadows merging into general dusk. But the sky above the capital still held the deep blue of a world that had remembered how to be beautiful. What happened to Della? She's still at Varathka. She refused every title the conclave offered, refused quarters in the capital, refused a formal position in the imperial hierarchy. She said, and again I'm quoting, I already have a job, and the soup isn't going to make itself. So she runs the sanctuary's kitchen. She feeds the egg tenders and the firekeepers and the stonemasons who are still finishing the upper chambers. She feeds any dragon who lands in the courtyard looking hungry. She feeds the fledglings from the new hatcheries, the first eggs quickened in Corvishan's rebuilt warmth hatched 6 weeks ago. 7 of them follow Della through the corridors like ducklings. The smallest a female, hatched from that mottled egg everyone except Della had written off. Pale translucent amber scales unlike any Sareth bloodline, sleeps on the counter beside the bread warmer and comes faster when Della calls her Pip, than when the egg tenders use her formal name. And Corvushan, still alive, still in the Heartstone chamber. Her body is failing that hasn't changed and nothing can change it, but she's comfortable, she's warm. And every morning before the camp wakes, Della walks into the chamber and sits beside her and sings. The same songs, and new ones. And the one she composed during the Reconstruction, the one that's half Highland colony and half egg tender chant, a song that belongs to neither species and both. Corvushan hums along in the deep registers, and the mountain resonates, and the eggs in the new hatcheries quicken in the warmth of a fire that was old before the empire existed, sustained by a woman who thinks the most important question in the world is whether someone would like a second bowl. Korath looked at his tablet. The notes he'd taken were sparse fragments, moments, a few direct quotes, not a report, not even close. "This isn't going to work as an official assessment," he said. "No," Vale agreed, "it isn't." The conclave recorded the event as the Verath Ka reconsecration. The official history notes the reconstruction timeline, the engineering innovations, the sovereign's involvement, the formal recognition of the voice of the Heartstone as a legal position open to Nankithari bond companions. It's a thorough document. 17 pages. It mentions Della Cray by name on page 11. Page 11. That's how official histories work. The people who matter most arrive latest in the record. Vale looked at Korath. But I was there. I watched a soup line cook walk across a fire break toward the oldest dragon in the empire and offer her a bowl of broth. I watched an ancient choose a bond companion for the first time in 4,000 years, and the companion she chose was a woman whose only qualification was that she wasn't afraid and she had a warm voice, and she didn't think kindness needed a reason. And the conclave. The conclave learned something that day. They learned it when Vashton knelt. They learned it when the sovereign lowered her head. They learned it when 14 warflights held formation above a refugee mess tent while a human woman sang weather songs to a dying dragon. They learned that power is not always a matter of fire or flight or the weight of centuries. Sometimes power is a ladle. Sometimes power is a voice that doesn't shake. Sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is a person who sees someone in pain and doesn't calculate the political implications before deciding to help. Vale stood. The telling was done. She could feel the familiar emptiness that came after carrying a memory back into daylight. The story told. The weight shifted, the echo still ringing in the deep resonance chambers of her chest where the Vethkal's vibration would live for the rest of her life. "Write your report," she told Korath. "Put in the structural data and the engineering assessments and the conclave's legal precedents. That's what they want, and it's not wrong. The facts matter." But she was already at the door. She paused, one clawed hand on the frame, her scarred wings catching the last of the daylight. "But if anyone asks you what really happened at Verath Ka, if anyone wants to know why the Thornfire Conclave changed 8,000 years of precedent in a single afternoon, why the most ancient dragon in the empire opened her eyes for a human, why the sovereign knelt in the ash, don't give them the report." "What do I give them?" Vale looked back at him, the warrior who had watched from the edge of a mess tent, the bonded soldier who had felt the Vethkal vibrate through her bones and understood, in that moment, that everything she believed about the boundaries between species was a wall built by fear and maintained by habit. "Tell them about the soup," she said. And she walked into the evening, her wings spread to catch the wind that still carried, if you listened carefully, the faintest echo of a woman's voice singing about the color of the sky at 6 in the morning.